In the grand theater of human ambition, where men and women chase shadows of significance and cling desperately to the illusions of permanence, there exists a profound truth that separates the truly powerful from the merely successful. This truth, understood by ancient philosophers and master strategists alike, declares that authentic power emerges not from what one can acquire, but from what one can relinquish without suffering. The modern world presents us with a peculiar paradox. We are told that accumulation equals achievement, that attachment signifies love, and that dependency demonstrates loyalty. Yet those who have studied the nature of power, from the courts of Renaissance Italy to the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, understand that these conventional wisdom fragments represent the very chains that bind us to weakness. Consider the executive who cannot sleep peacefully because market fluctuations threaten his portfolio, or the politician who sacrifices principle for the preservation of position. These individuals, despite their apparent success, remain prisoners of their own achievements. They have built elaborate cages of gold and called them kingdoms, never realizing that true sovereignty requires the ability to abandon the throne at will. The essence of walking away lies not in the physical act of departure, but in the psychological freedom that makes such departure possible. When we examine the lives of history's most influential figures, those who shaped rather than merely reacted to circumstances, we discover a common thread: they possessed an almost mystical capacity for detachment. They could hold their achievements lightly, their relationships without desperation, and their identities without rigidity. This principle extends far beyond material possessions. The ability to walk away encompasses our relationships with people, ideologies, identities, and even our own past selves. It requires a fundamental understanding that everything in existence is temporary, and that our attempts to create permanence through attachment only serve to diminish our actual power and increase our suffering. The businessman who can genuinely walk away from any deal negotiates from a position of unassailable strength. His counterparts, sensing this freedom, understand intuitively that they are dealing with someone who operates from abundance rather than scarcity. This psychological positioning creates advantages that no amount of preparation or cunning can replicate. Similarly, in personal relationships, those who love without possessiveness, who give without expectation of return, who engage without losing themselves in the process, discover that their very detachment becomes magnetic. People are drawn to those who offer presence without pressure, affection without addiction, and commitment without compromise of self. Yet this concept challenges our deepest conditioning. From childhood, we are taught to hold tight, to fight for what we want, to never give up. These lessons, while valuable in certain contexts, become destructive when applied universally. They create a psychology of scarcity that views every loss as diminishment and every gain as essential for survival. The transformation from attachment to authentic detachment requires a fundamental shift in identity. Instead of defining ourselves through external acquisitions, our possessions, achievements, relationships, or roles, we must cultivate an unshakable sense of self that exists independent of circumstances. This core identity becomes our true foundation, making all external elements optional rather than essential. This process begins with honest self-examination. We must identify the various threads by which we allow the world to control us. What are we afraid of losing? What do we believe we cannot live without? Which relationships, achievements, or possessions have become so integral to our self-concept that their removal would leave us feeling lost or worthless? These attachments reveal themselves through our emotional reactions. When someone threatens what we believe we own, whether that is a person, position, or possession, we experience fear, anger, or desperation. These emotions signal dependency, and dependency is the antithesis of power. The powerful individual experiences such threats with equanimity, knowing that their essential self remains untouchable regardless of external circumstances. The cultivation of this mindset requires daily practice. We must consciously release our grip on outcomes while maintaining full engagement in processes. This paradoxical approach, caring deeply while holding lightly, represents the pinnacle of emotional and psychological sophistication. In practical terms, this might mean pursuing career advancement with passion and skill while maintaining genuine indifference to whether promotion arrives next month or next decade. It could involve loving someone completely while accepting that they may choose to leave. It requires giving our best effort in any endeavor while remaining unattached to specific results. This approach fundamentally alters our relationship with failure and success. When we understand that both are temporary conditions rather than permanent identities, we can navigate setbacks without devastation and achievements without intoxication. We become responsible rather than reactive, choosing our engagement based on values rather than fears. The person who has achieved this level of detachment discovers something remarkable. The very willingness to walk away often makes walking away unnecessary. Clients become more eager to work with someone who doesn't need their business. Romantic partners find themselves more attracted to someone who loves them freely rather than needily. Employers value employees who contribute excellence without desperation. This principle operates through multiple psychological mechanisms. First, detachment eliminates the subtle manipulations and compromises that desperation breeds. When we need something, we inevitably distort ourselves to obtain it. This distortion is sensed by others and diminishes our appeal and effectiveness. Second, genuine detachment demonstrates confidence and self-sufficiency, qualities that command respect and influence. People instinctively follow those who appear to have options, who seem to choose rather than merely react to circumstances. Third, detachment allows for clearer thinking and better decision-making. When we are not emotionally invested in specific outcomes, we can evaluate situations more objectively and respond more strategically. Our judgment remains unclouded by fear or desire. The journey toward this liberated state is not without its challenges. Our conditioning runs deep, and the world around us constantly reinforces attachment-based thinking. We live in a society that profits from our dependencies, that encourages us to define ourselves through consumption and acquisition. Moreover, detachment can be easily confused with indifference or apathy. True detachment is not emotional numbness or withdrawal from engagement. Rather, it represents the highest form of engagement: participation without perdition, caring without clinging, loving without losing oneself in the beloved. The detached individual experiences life more fully, not less. Freed from the constant anxiety of protecting what they have or acquiring what they lack, they can be present to each moment without the distortion of fear or craving. Their relationships become more authentic because they are chosen rather than compelled by need. This transformation requires time and patience. We cannot simply decide to become detached and expect immediate results. Like any fundamental change in consciousness, it emerges through consistent practice and repeated choice. Each time we choose presence over possession, being over having, we strengthen our capacity for true freedom. The process often involves periods of discomfort as we release familiar patterns and face the unknown territory of genuine independence. Our ego mind, accustomed to defining itself through external references, may initially experience this freedom as a kind of death. In many ways, it is the death of the small, fearful self that mistakes its possessions for its identity. Yet from this death emerges something far more magnificent, a self that exists independent of circumstances, relationships, or achievements. This self cannot be threatened because it owns nothing that can be taken away. It cannot be manipulated because it needs nothing that others can provide or withhold. It cannot be destroyed because it recognizes itself as essentially indestructible. Part 2, The Alchemy of Self-Destruction and Renewal. The second pillar of authentic power emerges from a truth that appears paradoxical to conventional thinking: only by destroying our weak self can we become indestructible. This destruction is not the violent collapse that fear imagines, but rather the careful dismantling of illusions, dependencies, and false identities that have masqueraded as our true nature. The weak self is a construct built from societal expectations, childhood conditioning, past traumas, and the endless stream of external validations or rejections we have collected throughout our lives. This fabricated identity feels real because we have invested years of energy in maintaining it, defending it, and seeking to enhance it. Yet it remains fundamentally fragile because it depends entirely on circumstances beyond our control. This weak self manifests in countless ways throughout our daily experience. It appears as the need for others' approval before we can feel valuable, the requirement for specific achievements before we can feel successful, the demand for certain possessions before we can feel secure. It shows up as our emotional reactivity to criticism, our anxiety about future outcomes, our inability to be alone with ourselves without distraction. Most destructively, the weak self perpetually seeks to protect and preserve itself through control mechanisms that ultimately create the very vulnerability they attempt to eliminate. The person who desperately needs to be liked becomes unlikable through their obvious neediness. The individual who must win every argument loses respect through their inability to listen or acknowledge other perspectives. The employee who cannot risk any failure becomes so cautious they contribute nothing of real value. The process of destroying this weak self requires tremendous courage because it initially feels like suicide. We have identified so completely with our fears, needs, and reactive patterns that releasing them seems to threaten our very existence. Our mind generates elaborate justifications for maintaining these limitations, arguing that our dependencies are actually love, our fears are merely prudence, our control mechanisms are simply good planning. Yet those who undertake this inner revolution discover something remarkable. What they thought was their essential self was merely a collection of habits, beliefs, and emotional patterns that could be changed. Beneath these surface constructions lies something far more substantial, a core identity that exists independent of circumstances, a consciousness that observes thoughts and emotions without being defined by them. The destruction of the weak self begins with radical honesty about our current condition. We must acknowledge the ways we compromise ourselves for approval, the compromises we make to avoid conflict, the dreams we abandon to maintain security. This inventory requires unflinching self-examination because our ego mind will attempt to convince us that our limitations are actually virtues, our fears are wisdom, our dependencies are loyalty. Consider the professional who remains in an unfulfilling career because leaving would disappoint family expectations or threaten financial security. This person has allowed external circumstances to override their inner knowing, creating a life that serves other people's dreams while abandoning their own. The weak self argues that this sacrifice demonstrates responsibility and maturity, but authentic examination reveals it as a form of slow suicide, the trading of one's essential aliveness for the illusion of safety. Or examine the individual who cannot express disagreement in relationships because they fear abandonment or conflict. Their weak self has convinced them that their people-pleasing represents love and consideration, when it actually represents a profound disrespect for both themselves and others. By refusing to show up authentically, they deny others the opportunity to love their true self while ensuring that any affection they receive is directed toward a false persona. The destruction process requires systematic dismantling of these protective mechanisms. We must learn to feel our fears without being controlled by them, to acknowledge our needs without being enslaved by them, to recognize our desires without losing ourselves in their pursuit. This transformation often begins with small acts of rebellion against our own conditioning. The people-pleaser practices saying no to requests that violate their boundaries. The perfectionist deliberately submits imperfect work to experience the world's continued existence despite their flaws. The control enthusiast experiments with spontaneity and uncertainty. Each of these micro-rebellions creates cracks in the structure of the weak self. Through these fissures, our authentic nature begins to emerge, not as another constructed identity, but as the spacious awareness that was always present beneath our layers of conditioning. The emergence of authentic power through this destruction process follows predictable stages. Initially, there is often a period of disorientation as familiar reference points dissolve. The person who has always defined themselves through others' opinions may feel lost when they stop seeking external validation. The individual who has organized their life around avoiding specific feared outcomes may feel purposeless when they release these organizing principles. This disorientation represents a necessary phase of transition. Like a snake shedding its skin or a butterfly emerging from its cocoon, the transformation requires a period of vulnerability while the new form takes shape. During this time, it becomes essential to trust the process rather than rushing to construct new identities that might simply recreate old patterns with different content. Gradually, something new begins to emerge, not through construction but through revelation. Beneath all the protective layers and reactive patterns lies an essence that has been present all along but obscured by our frantic attempts to create security through control. This essence possesses qualities that the weak self could never achieve: unshakable peace, genuine confidence, spontaneous compassion, and effortless effectiveness. The person who has completed this transformation, or rather, allowed it to complete itself, discovers they have become essentially invulnerable. Not because they can control outcomes, but because they no longer need to. Their security comes from within, their worth is self-evident, their peace is independent of circumstances. This inner transformation fundamentally alters their external experience. Relationships become more authentic because they no longer feel compelled to manage others' reactions or hide their true thoughts and feelings. Professional endeavors become more successful because they can take appropriate risks without being paralyzed by fear of failure. Creative expression flows more freely because they are not constantly editing themselves for external approval. Perhaps most importantly, they develop the capacity to remain centered during chaos, peaceful during conflict, and compassionate during others' unconscious behavior. Because they are no longer reactive to external triggers, they can respond from wisdom rather than conditioning, from choice rather than compulsion. This transformation creates a peculiar paradox. By destroying the self that sought to be indestructible through control and accumulation, we discover an indestructible essence that needs no protection. The weak self's attempts at invulnerability through domination, possession, or perfection always fail because they are fundamentally based on fear and separation. The authentic self's invulnerability emerges from unity and love, a recognition that our essential nature cannot be threatened because it shares the eternal quality of consciousness itself. The practical implications of this transformation extend into every area of life. In business, the person who has destroyed their weak self can make decisions based on principles rather than fears, can negotiate without desperation, can lead without manipulation. They command respect not through force but through presence, influence not through coercion but through example. In relationships, they love without possessiveness, commit without losing independence, support without enabling dependency. Their very freedom becomes attractive to others who sense the possibility of their own liberation through proximity to someone who has achieved it. In creative endeavors, they express without self-consciousness, innovate without fear of judgment, share their gifts without attachment to reception. Their work carries an authenticity that resonates with others because it emerges from genuine rather than manufactured inspiration. The journey of destroying the weak self is ultimately a return to our original nature, not as helpless infants, but as the conscious, powerful, loving beings we were designed to be. This return requires tremendous courage because it means releasing everything we thought we needed for security and discovering what we actually are beneath our constructed protections. Yet this courage is not the desperate bravery of someone rushing into battle, but the quiet confidence of someone who has seen through the illusion of separation and understands their essential invulnerability. They walk through the world knowing that nothing can ultimately harm their true self because their true self is not a thing that can be damaged but rather the awareness in which all experiences arise and pass away. This understanding transforms everything. Challenges become opportunities for growth rather than threats to be avoided. Failures become information rather than verdicts on our worth. Others' opinions become interesting data rather than determinants of our value. Success becomes a natural expression of our authentic contribution rather than a desperate attempt to prove our adequacy. The person who has completed this transformation often appears ordinary from the outside, yet their presence carries a quality that others find mysteriously compelling. They seem to know something that others seek, to possess a peace that others crave, to embody a freedom that others only dream of achieving. This transformation is available to anyone willing to undertake the journey from dependence to independence to interdependence, from reactive patterns to responsive choices, from fear-based control to love-based surrender. It requires nothing more than the willingness to question our assumptions about who we are and what we need, combined with the patience to allow our true nature to emerge from beneath layers of conditioning. Part 3, The Architecture of Unshakable Power. The synthesis of detachment and self-transformation creates a foundation for authentic power that transcends conventional understanding of strength, influence, and success. This power operates through principles that appear counterintuitive to those still trapped in attachment-based thinking, yet reveal themselves as natural laws to those who have undergone the profound transformation from weak to essential self. True power manifests not as the ability to control external circumstances, but as the capacity to remain unshaken regardless of what circumstances arise. This unshakability emerges from a deep understanding that our essential nature exists independent of any particular configuration of events, relationships, or conditions. The person who has achieved this understanding discovers they can engage fully with life while remaining fundamentally untouchable by its inevitable changes. This principle challenges everything our culture teaches about strength and influence. We are conditioned to believe that power means getting what we want, defeating opposition, accumulating resources, or controlling outcomes. Yet examination of those who seem most powerful by these conventional measures often reveals lives filled with anxiety, paranoia, and constant struggle to maintain their positions. Contrast this with the individual who has learned to generate their security from within. They approach negotiations without desperation, knowing that walking away is always an option. They enter relationships without neediness, offering love freely rather than trading affection for validation. They pursue goals without attachment to timelines, allowing results to emerge naturally rather than forcing outcomes through manipulation or exhaustion. This inner-generated power creates external effects that conventional power-seeking cannot replicate. People naturally gravitate toward those who seem complete within themselves, who offer presence rather than demands, who embody peace rather than anxiety. This magnetic quality emerges not from effort but from the natural attractiveness of authenticity and inner freedom. The architecture of such power rests on several foundational elements that must be understood and integrated simultaneously. These elements work together to create a synergistic effect where the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. The first element involves cultivating what might be called principled indifference, a state of caring deeply about values and integrity while remaining genuinely indifferent to specific outcomes. This paradoxical stance allows for maximum effort without attachment, passionate engagement without desperation, clear intention without rigid expectations. The person operating from principled indifference might work intensely to build a business while remaining truly unattached to whether that business succeeds according to external measures. They understand that their role is to provide their best contribution and allow results to emerge according to forces beyond their control. This approach paradoxically increases the likelihood of conventional success while eliminating the suffering that typically accompanies both failure and achievement. Similarly, they might love someone completely while accepting that person's freedom to choose differently. This love without possessiveness often proves more attractive and sustainable than relationships built on mutual dependency and control. The beloved senses the freedom being offered and often chooses to remain close to someone who doesn't require their presence for validation or security. The second foundational element involves developing what could be termed outcome independence, the ability to define success internally rather than through external validation or specific results. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to results, but rather ensuring that one's sense of worth and direction comes from alignment with values rather than achievement of particular goals. The person who has developed outcome independence continues to set goals and work toward them, but their peace and self-respect don't depend on achieving those goals within specific timeframes or in particular ways. They understand that external conditions involve countless variables beyond their control, while their internal alignment remains within their influence. This orientation fundamentally changes their relationship to both success and failure. Achievements become appreciated without creating addiction or identity distortion. Setbacks become information and opportunities for growth rather than evidence of inadequacy or reasons for despair. The emotional roller coaster that typically accompanies conventional goal pursuit smooths into a steady state of engaged equanimity. The third element requires mastering what might be called strategic vulnerability, the conscious choice to remain open and authentic while maintaining appropriate boundaries and discernment. This involves distinguishing between emotional armor that protects our false self and wise discrimination that honors our true self. Many people confuse vulnerability with weakness, just as they confuse detachment with indifference. True vulnerability requires tremendous strength because it means feeling our emotions fully without being controlled by them, sharing our truth without manipulating others' responses, and receiving feedback without defensive reactions. The person who has mastered strategic vulnerability can admit mistakes without losing credibility, express uncertainty without appearing weak, and show emotion without becoming reactive. This authentic transparency often disarms potential opposition and creates unexpected alliances because others sense the absence of hidden agendas or manipulative intentions. The fourth foundational element involves cultivating what we might call temporal transcendence, the ability to operate simultaneously in immediate present moment awareness and long-term visionary thinking without being trapped by either perspective. This means making decisions that honor both current reality and future possibility without becoming paralyzed by trying to predict or control outcomes. This temporal transcendence prevents the common mistakes of being either too reactive to immediate circumstances or too detached from present reality. The person operating from this perspective can respond appropriately to current conditions while maintaining alignment with longer-term values and vision. They might sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term growth, or conversely, prioritize present relationships over abstract future achievements. The key is making these choices from wisdom rather than fear, from clarity rather than confusion, from love rather than anxiety. The integration of these elements creates what could be described as effortless effectiveness, the ability to accomplish significant results without strain, struggle, or compromise of integrity. This effectiveness emerges not from superior technique or harder effort, but from operating in alignment with natural principles rather than against them. The person who has achieved this integration discovers that appropriate action often feels easier than inappropriate action, that authentic expression requires less energy than maintaining false personas, that loving responses create better outcomes than fearful reactions. They begin to experience life as flowing through them rather than requiring constant pushing and pulling from them. This shift fundamentally alters their relationship to challenge and opposition. Rather than seeing obstacles as problems to be overcome through force, they recognize them as information about current conditions and opportunities to apply wisdom and creativity. They approach conflict as a chance to find solutions that serve everyone involved rather than battles to be won at others' expense. The practical application of these principles creates remarkable results across all areas of life. In professional settings, the person operating from this foundation often finds themselves naturally rising to leadership positions not through political maneuvering but through the magnetic effect of their integrity and competence. Others want to work with and for someone who embodies these qualities. In personal relationships, they discover that their very independence makes them more attractive and trustworthy as partners. Their ability to love without neediness creates space for others to love freely in return. Their refusal to engage in manipulation or control allows for authentic intimacy that many people have never experienced. In creative endeavors, they find their most authentic expression emerging naturally without the strain and self-consciousness that typically accompany artistic effort. Their work carries a quality of genuineness that resonates with others because it emerges from truth rather than calculation. Perhaps most importantly, they develop a relationship with uncertainty and change that transforms these typically stressful experiences into opportunities for growth and discovery. Because they are not dependent on specific conditions for their peace and well-being, they can navigate life's inevitable transitions with grace and even excitement. The person who has integrated these principles into their being becomes a source of stability and inspiration for others who are still struggling with attachment and reactivity. Not through preaching or teaching, but simply through their example of what becomes possible when someone learns to walk away from everything that doesn't serve their highest good while embracing everything that does. This transformation is not the result of willpower or determination in the conventional sense, but rather emerges from a deep understanding of what we actually are beneath our conditioning and fears. When we recognize our essential nature as consciousness itself rather than the temporary thoughts, emotions, and circumstances that arise within consciousness, everything changes. From this recognition flows the natural ability to walk away from anything that requires us to betray our truth, compromise our integrity, or abandon our compassion. We discover that we can love without losing ourselves, succeed without selling ourselves, and contribute without exhausting ourselves. The paradox completes itself. By becoming willing to lose everything external, we discover something internal that cannot be lost. By destroying the weak self that sought security through control and accumulation, we reveal the strong self that is inherently secure because it recognizes its essential unity with the source of all security. This is the true power that emerges when we learn to walk away from everything that doesn't honor who we really are. It is the indestructible strength that appears when we allow our false protections to crumble and reveal the invulnerable essence that was always present beneath them. Such power serves not only the individual who has developed it, but the entire world that benefits from their presence. They become agents of transformation simply through being themselves, demonstrations of possibility that inspire others to begin their own journey toward authentic freedom and power. In a world filled with those who seek power through domination, accumulation, and control, those who embody true power through detachment, authenticity, and love become precious resources. They point the way toward a different possibility, a way of being that honors both individual sovereignty and collective well-being, that achieves genuine success without requiring anyone else's failure, that discovers invulnerable strength through the willingness to be completely vulnerable. This is the inheritance available to anyone willing to undertake the journey from false to true, from reactive to responsive, from attached to free. It requires nothing more than the courage to question who we think we are and the patience to discover who we actually are beneath all our protective layers and compensatory mechanisms. The transformation is both the most difficult and the most natural thing we can do. Difficult because it requires releasing everything we have learned to value, natural because it reveals what we have always been beneath our learned limitations. In the end, we discover that true power was never something to be acquired but, rather something to be uncovered, not something to be built but, something to be revealed, not something to be achieved but, something to be remembered. And, in that remembering, everything changes. The world remains the same, yet our relationship to it transforms completely. We walk through the same circumstances that once caused suffering with peace, approach the same challenges that once created fear with excitement, engage the same relationships that once demanded sacrifice with freedom. This is the ultimate victory, not over others, but over our own limitations. Not through force, but through understanding. Not by becoming something we were not, but by remembering what we have always been beneath our temporary confusion about our true nature. The power to walk away from everything becomes, ultimately, the power to embrace everything from a place of freedom rather than fear, love rather than need, choice rather than compulsion. And, in that embracing, we discover that what we thought we needed to acquire was always already present, what we thought we needed to protect was never actually threatened, and what we thought we needed to become we always already were.